comments, just type them into the chat here. We are constantly monitoring them and we will relay your questions to Heidi unless she herself is also reading it. Okay. So without much ado, please give Heidi a very warm welcome from down under. Thank you, Heidi.
Thank you. Now, can everyone see my screen okay? Hopefully you're seeing the one with the slides on. Excellent. All right, so today we're going to talk about Azure Data Studio. Now, if it looks like I'm not looking at you, it's because I have two portable screens next to me. So I have the Teams on there and some other stuff happening. So I'm definitely here. I'm on the other side of the world, technically kind of in the future. So it's my Thursday morning. I think your Wednesday night, or for those of you who are in the US. Bit about me, I'm predominantly a business intelligence developer, but I spent a good portion of my career doing software development. That's what I'm, bachelor degree qualified in is computer science. But for the last couple of years, I went on a bit of a rampage gamification with Microsoft certs. So I've got a few here. I have about 16 at the moment. Now, don't let that intimidate you. I used to have none. And I used to hate doing exams, but now I've become quite fond of them. I do the learn modules, I compete in the challenges, and then I go, yeah, let's try doing the certs. So I have a lot. So if you're ever interested in certs, let me know. But ALM, DLM's my jam, and I love attending tech events all over the world. You can reach me on Twitter. You can reach me on my blog. Don't worry, it's out of date, but there's a contact us, so feel free to use that to ask me questions. And of course, given the accent, I am based in Australia. Some people get me confused with being a Kiwi New Zealander, but no, I'm Australian, but I don't mind. I love the Kiwis. So today we're going to talk about an overview of Azure Data Studio. We're going to look at some of the specific feature sets, so things like code snippets, widgets, extensions, some other functionality, which is notebooks. Notebooks is akin to sort of your Python notebooks. If anyone's doing Python development, you would have those files. I think it's the IPYNB extension files. And then we look at things like Git integration. Or if we've got time, we'll do a bit of GitHub Copilot and, of course, lots of demo time. So what I'm probably going to do is race through the slide deck and then open up the tool and go through it that way. Sometimes I go jump between the two. So I'm going to ask this, but you're all probably going to only be able to drop a message in the chat. But who's already heard about Azure Data Studio and who thinks it's only for Azure? Because this is a misconception that occurred. So while you're all answering that, I'll give you a bit of a background on Azure Data Studio. So it was first released as SQL Ops Studio, and they released it at Past Summit in the US. So the time was Professional Association SQL Server Summit held in Seattle in November. Now it's branded as the Redgate Past Data Community Summit. So when they released it, it was SQL Ops Studio, similar timing to when SQL on Linux was released. There's a key reason for that. Azure Data Studio, it's not meant to replace SQL Server Management Studio. It has feature overlap, but not feature parity. So there's things in SSMS that aren't in Azure Data Studio and vice versa. But it works with Windows, Linux, and Macs, or works on Windows, Linux, and Mac, and it works with a variety of databases, not just Azure. It's also used for SQL Server. It's good. Lots of people using it already. What are you doing here? But yeah, and it works with on-prem. So that's why I wanted to point this out, because a lot of people, when they see Azure in the name, they assume it only works with Azure hosted things, so Azure SQL, Azure SQL MI, or Elastic Pool databases, and to now Fabric SQL database. But it works with the on-prem SQL Server as well. And I don't recall how far back it will go, but as long as you've got a connection string and the authentication mechanism, it's all good. First things to note, where you're going to get it. It's available on the docs. So if you look for Azure Data Studio on the docs page, you'll find one very similar to this. With that, you can download multiple versions. So you'll see a different list here. The thing that I really love about Azure Data Studio, it's quite lightweight and it has a user installer. Why do I love that? It's because anytime I go out to client sites or new laptops, I don't necessarily have admin privileges, so I can't install software sometimes, but user installers are often possible. So I can get going kind of day one with an organization by just installing the user installer version. And then if you are running it on a Mac or Linux, there's options for that too. I've never installed it on Mac or Linux. I know other people have, but me personally, I run a Windows machine. And the other thing to note is that they do make available what they call the insider build, which is basically a beta version of the next release. So as that becomes available, that's available directly on GitHub. Because Azure Data Studio is considered an open source project, all the code and the installers are available through the GitHub repository. This is also where you're going to log any issues you might have with the product, any feature requests you might have, as opposed to other Microsoft and Azure solutions. You'll use the GitHub repo for that. And for those of you who are going to ask potentially about SQL Server Analysis Services and being able to connect to that, it is there in the GitHub items. But so far, all the feedback on it, other than customers and people like us asking to have the feature, the response from Microsoft so far has been it's not intended to support SQL Server Analysis Services at this stage, which makes sense. You've got SQL Server Management Studio for that. We've got other products, third party like DAX Studio. We can also use things like Tabular Editor. So there's alternatives, but it would be nice. All right. So what does it look like? This is, as this video plays, you'll see that we get a basic interface. That interface is going to have a landing area, a main canvas area, and two sets of menus. So we have our left navigation menu and we have our top menu area. Our left navigation, we can change some of these widgets over time, but out of the box, you'll get the server one, which is the server connections. You'll get the ability to search across files. You'll get a notebook one. You'll get one for database projects if you install the database project extension. You get one for PowerShell. Yes, we can run PowerShell commands inside there. We can also look at the files. So if we open a folder up, we can navigate through the files of that folder. We can do Git integration. So Git integration as opposed to Git enablement means it's directly integrated within the product, within the IDE. So we can commit changes, we can do pull requests, we can do clones, we can do all that sort of stuff straight from from Azure Data Studio. And then of course we can add extensions. There's extra things like keyboard shortcuts, and you can install an extension that lets you replicate the SSMS keyboard shortcuts if you love those. And Control-Shift-P is pointed out here because that allows us to get extra menu areas where we can do things like all the user settings and widgets and all that stuff I'm going to show you shortly. To the astute people in the chat saying it looks like VS Code, very much so. The Azure Data Studio code base is a forked code base from the Visual Studio Code code base, which means some of the extensions will work between the two, some are specific. So if you treat it like the Visual Studio Code specifically designed for data professionals, that's kind of where Azure Data Studio fits in. And I'll go through the interface in more detail when we open it because it makes more sense when you actually open it up. But you can see we've got lots of options. The first one I want to talk about feature-wise is code snippets. So code snippets is something we saw in SQL Server Management Studio. For those of you who've used that already, it's the ability to have sort of saved little queries that you might want to reuse across your team or across different environments. So we can use the query window, and as we start typing, it'll come up with all the different snippets that are available. Microsoft's been kind enough to put some out of the box, so we can get things like the templates for creating an index, for creating a table, for dropping a table. And you can see on the right that it already put some commentary in there. But if we create our own widgets, so when we do that Control-Shift-P, we can go into the user snippets and say, hey, look, I want to define snippets for the SQL language. And then we can go in and create our own. So I created one that will just, select the top 10 rows because I do that every so often. And that way I can just type SQL. It'll come up with SQL and my different snippets. I select one, that'll then drop the template into the query window, and then we can go ahead and run it. We can modify it, we can make changes to it. But it's very handy if you've got repeatable blocks of code that you want to use all the time, is to create it as a snippet. And then because these snippets are stored in a JSON file, you can distribute that around your team so that you've all got consistent snippets for your team if you find it's the same over and over again. Another one is widgets. So widgets occur at different levels, and treat this like a really basic kind of dashboard. So when you connect to any SQL server, so if you connect to a SQL server, say on-prem, you get the instance level widgets. So that can be things like what are the space used by a database, what's the last known backup, what are the slow running queries. Microsoft create a few out of the box for us, but we can go ahead and define our own widgets. So I could create a widget that tells me what's the last full backup for all my databases. I put that into a query. I then put that query into a location and define the graphical part for it. So the fact that I want like a chart, and then I drop that in the configuration, and then it becomes a widget available at the instance level. We've also got the ability to search across objects, which is a really cool feature for times when people say to you, oh, it's in the customer table. There's a widget that allows you to search, wildcard search across the objects, and you can search for customer and it'll come up with all the objects and what schema they're in and what type they are. So then you can go back to whoever in your team or cross teams is talking and you go, hey, you said customer table, we've got about 5 of those. Which one of these were you referring to, type thing. So you can create any number of things there. Then at a database level, you can do the same. We can go into a database and have different widgets defined just for that database. So we might want to see what's the biggest table. So we can do our like space used by table, or we might just want to see some query statistics. We can put all that in a widget and have it available at the table, at the database level as well. And then extensions. Now I'm skipping the videos because I'm going to open it up and show you. But with extensions, this is where we can add any number of tooling into the Azure Data Studio. So you'll see a lot of the Visual Studio ones, and then you'll see ones for Azure Data Studio. The thing to be mindful of here is these are published by both Microsoft and third-party people. So make sure that if you are installing these in your organization, that your security team is okay with it. Sometimes they're not. But if the case, usually when they're Microsoft ones, you get a bit of a okay, because you're already using Microsoft tooling. So sometimes that's a bit easier. I've shown here one called Poor Man's T-SQL Formatter, which I love. I used to use that with SSMS and Visual Studio. So the fact that it has an Azure Data Studio extension is awesome, because now I can just quickly format code blocks. And I'll show you some little, if I remember to do it, some little snippets that I use when people give me like single line queries, which often happens with like SQL Server reporting services sometimes. All the query just gets munged into one line. So I use the formatter to put it back into multi-line. If you've got that debate in your team about commas at the start or at the end, there's some quick little keyboard shortcuts and things you can do to get around that using Azure Data Studio. But some of my favorites that I like to use, of course, are things like the schema compares, the database projects. There's things like you can do profiler in here. You'd probably use extended events these days before using that. The SQL agent one's really cool, because with agent inside SSMS, you get that list of SQL Server agent jobs, but you don't know whether they've passed or not passed. You don't know whether they're success or failure. You don't know their rate trending over time. You don't know how long they're running just from the GUI. Whereas with the SQL agent extension inside Azure Data Studio, and I wish I'd put a screenshot in, it basically gives you a tabular format representation where you see the list of SQL Server agent jobs, you see the last known success or failure, you see when it's sort of scheduled to run, and then you see a little bar graph of how it's ran over the course of a period of time. So it means you can get to do those little profiling of your agent jobs without actually opening them all up. And there are times when you're working in Azure Data Studio, if it's something that can be scripted, great, works great. If it's something that has a GUI element and they haven't built the GUI element into Azure Data Studio, you'll often see the ability to right click and it'll show you open in SSMS. In the same way in SSMS, you will see open in Azure Data Studio. I should have also pointed out earlier, when you do install it previously, I think it was SSMS 16 through to about 19, it used to install Azure Data Studio in the background bundled with. So sometimes you already have it without realizing, but now it's gone back to being an individual installer. And of course, the GitHub Copilot is an extra extension, but that is a paid piece of functionality. Notebooks. So notebooks is the combination of both Markdown and text. And with the differentiator here, notebooks has always worked with the Python programming language. So a lot of people have been using Jupyter notebooks, they've been using Jupyter IDEs, they've been using Visual Studio Code. Now with Azure Data Studio, we can also use T-SQL language in them. And so we can build a notebook like this, where we have the combination of both Markdown, textual commentary, and code in the one file. And then you can also run that notebook. And as it runs each cell block, because you can have a series of cells. So in this case, I've only got one cell of Markdown, one cell of code in the bottom picture. But if I was to run that, the result set would appear below. So it would look a bit like this. So I can see the result set for my notebook for each cell. You can run cells in isolation, you can run the full cell. And the cool thing, you can even take this and deploy it to a SQL Server on-prem and schedule the notebook to run. I'm not entirely sure why you'd want to do that, other than do sort of some diagnostics in your environment, or if you're doing some machine learning models. But otherwise, it's an option that's available to you. But what I often use this for is if you take a notebook, send it to someone, get them to run it, tell them to leave the result set in it, and then send it back, because you can either clear the results or save the results in. If you're storing these notebooks into source control, definitely clear the results. Otherwise, if you're doing some troubleshooting, let's say you have a user that says, hey, I've got an issue accessing this database, this table, I'm getting an error. If you quickly want to troubleshoot what that error is, you can send them a notebook with different queries in to get their username, to get what server they're connecting to, what database they're trying to connect to, and the query they're trying to run. Tell them to run it and send it back. And then you see firsthand what they've tried, who their user account is, what database they're trying to connect to, what their error they're getting, and it's all there. And it's all under their profile. From a data breach standpoint, be conscious that if someone runs these notebooks and sends them to you, the data is therefore not secured in the sense that it's taken the data out of wherever it was stored, put it in a result set in a notebook, and now it's in clear text readable format in this notebook. So if people send it around, it's a bit of a data breach concern. You don't get the ability to filter or search or do any smarts with these result sets. You can basically just read them in like a grid format. Whereas the query editor within Azure Data Studio is much more feature rich, and I'll show you a bit about that as well. Comparisons, because everyone loves a comparison. SSMS doesn't do all the things that Azure Data Studio does, and vice versa. Now this docs, where I've got this screenshot from, apologies, I should have included the reference. It's updated all the time. So at the moment, some of the things that you see in SSMS, in Azure Data Studio that you don't see in SSMS is things like source control integration. That's now came in SSMS 21, but it's, been a little while coming. Themes, we can change the theme of our Azure Data Studio, dark theme, light theme, any customized theme that we might want. We can export the results to more options than is in SSMS. So SSMS has always had the ability to save your query results out, but with Azure Data Studio, we get extra options like JSON. Why is that kind of cool? Because if you're working with web developers doing payloads or sort of your data lake architectures, you can run a query, get the results in a tabular format that you're viewing, just say save it as JSON, and then you can flick that JSON over to like your web developers to say, hey, this is the payload I'm expecting to come through in order for it to store correctly in our database structure. We can do things like schema compare, and we can also, of course, do the database projects within Azure Data Studio. So before you would have done them predominantly in Visual Studio, maybe Visual Studio Code. Now you get to use Azure Data Studio for that as well. So many more things. On the flip side, if you're DBA heavy, if you're heavy in the DBA space, doing things like always encrypted, maintenance plans, query store, service broker, that sort of stuff, you're probably going to look to go more SSMS than you are Azure Data Studio. I find I use both tools intermittently, depending on what I'm doing. I'll often just quickly, if I want to quickly run a query, I'll open up Azure Data Studio because its load time's quite fast. I'll connect to the environment, run a query. If I'm doing database project work, I'll use that as well. But if I'm doing just, some database administration, I might flip and use SSMS. Or if I want to generate scripts out of a database, because that functionality is not on the Azure Data Studio side. So that's where you right-click a database, go into scripts, generate scripts, you pick which objects you want and have it generate out those script files. Question in the chat, will we share just the file that contains the results already in comparison with using source code? So the sharing of the file, so with the notebooks there, when you share the file, it's more, I would say you more do it if you're doing troubleshooting with users or training. So you can write Markdown to train users how to connect to databases, how to run a query, or other co-workers if they're trying to get a familiarity with your environment, if you've got any daily housekeeping checks, or you just want to have notebooks that explain how to use different features and functionality. And I think it was SQL Server 2019 that actually came with a number of notebooks installed. When you installed that, you could go find those notebooks and it would teach you how to use the new functionality. Source control predominantly is if you want to do version management. So if your notebook is for an ongoing process that you have within your team, then you're probably going to want to put it in source control so you have the versions. Make sure you remove the result set so it's not including any data in it, and you can commit that to your source control repository and then have the team grab it from there. In the same way, if it is a solution used by your entire DB team or data team, then you might want to put it in your general source control repository. You might have a utilities one. You can commit it there and tell the team to get it from there, as opposed to emailing the file or chucking on SharePoint or Teams or anything of that nature. Add to that list, handling connection management. Yeah, good call. I agree, and I'll show people that. Git integration. So at a high level for the Git integration, we can open a folder that has a Git repository in it. So for those of you who've not worked with Git before, Git's a source control repository type. It's quite popular. It's one of the most popular out there. If you're using the Microsoft products, you'll find it in both Azure DevOps, both DevOps, the service, and server, the on-prem edition, as well as GitHub and GitHub Enterprise. It's also available in other platforms, GitLab and the like. But what you do is you've got a remote repository and a local repository. In this case, if we have cloned a remote repository locally or we've initialized a local repository, we can open that location inside Azure Data Studio. It understands that that's a Git repository, and therefore if you make changes to any files in that folder, it will detect them and indicate that, hey, there's been a change to a file. Do you want to commit it? Do you want to sync it? Or you may have committed it and it's now in a remote repository once you've pushed it. So you can also indicate, hey, I want to pull the remote repository down, or I want to push the local changes up to the remote repository. Now I'm going to come out of the slides for a little while and play with the tooling. So the first thing to note, Azure Data Studio, now you can't see me actually clicking the button, but trust me, I'm about to click the button to open the product. So I'll click it. Hopefully it opens on this window, but it's probably not. Now this is the Azure Data Studio I've just opened. So straight away, within the space of seconds, I now have an Azure Data Studio. Really quick and easy. With the left navigation, now I'm going to do one of the features first is if we hit the Control Plus button, which because I'm telling you that because you can't see me do it. With the Control Plus, it allows me to zoom in and out the entirety of Azure Data Studio, including the query window. So this is something that Azure Data Studio has over other products. So if you've got anyone with visual impairments that mean they need text at a larger ratio, using that zoom in feature can be quite handy. Also, when you're presenting or when you're showing other people within your team, handy to be able to zoom in and out just by using the Control Plus, the Control Minus, so you can get whatever sizing is suitable for you. I'm going to drop it down one so we can see most of the screen. This is our landing page. We can do quick things from this, open up previous files, go to the documentation, watch any videos about the product. You can see Vicky Hart there. She was one of the PMs that was on the original team building a lot of this. So if we go first into our connections, this is where we can add different server connections. I have a ton in here. Don't worry, these are my personal ones. Heidi at HeidiHasting.com is me, and the demo tenant is also me, and the SQL Server 2020 me. So don't worry, this is not anyone else's stuff but my own. With this, it stores all previously open ones, so I can go in and add a new one. I can add from the list, I can clear the list. So I might say I want to connect to my local SQL Server. I'm going to use Windows Auth, I could use SQL Auth, I could enter a little bit of a gray area. In the more recent additions to SQL Server, connecting to the database engine, yes, you can use an Entra connection, but otherwise I can pick Windows Auth. I can specify my database. If I put, say, one of my Azure ones, when I specify the Entra authentication, I also have to specify which Entra account. The cool thing here is now it stores those profiles. So once I've added an account, it keeps that account there. And if we jump out, you'll see the accounts here. So I already have a couple stored, which means I can just reuse them or I can get rid of them. So friendly reminder, if you're using these for client delivery or you're using, say, your personal computer against work stuff, make sure you remove these so that you're not having the connections of customers or your work profile on your personal computer all the time.
Hey, Heidi,
But they're still
I
there.
have a question.
Yeah, sure.
So, the SSMS, you can save all your 200 servers as an XML file as registered servers. Is it possible to import those servers into Azure Data Studio?
That's a great question about do we have the ability to import the registered servers list from SSMS to Azure Data Studio? I'm not sure. I've not done it. It wouldn't surprise me if there's a feature to do it. I've never seen an import on the server level though.
Okay, thanks.
But these would be probably stored in a JSON file in app data. So you could, depending on if you'd have to convert the XML to JSON and put it over. But no, good question. That's a newie. I've not had that one yet. The other thing to note, once you do have the server connection, you can put it in groups, these server groups here. So we can specify a group and pick a color palette. Unfortunately, we can't customize this to put additional ones in. So I can group my servers into different areas and I can just remove them if I don't want them in the list. I can delete the connection. It's not going to delete the server. It's just going to delete the connection. If I double click on a connection, it's going to go to green once it's connected. Otherwise, it's just sitting there inactive, not connected. Once it's connected, we can go ahead and run queries. We can look at the dashboards and everything against it. So I can go in and say manage, and that's going to give me that database instance level set of widgets. And then we can go in lower and go to a database level and go into those and go, yeah, I want to manage my Data Saturday one. And now I can see all the tables within the Data Saturday, or SQL Saturday, as I like. But other things you can do when you're on that manage, we can use the different information to straight away see what our version of our server is. We can do database projects from these screens as well. So if you've got an existing database, you can quickly change it to a database project. Question, is there a Copilot integration with that Data Studio? Yes, GitHub Copilot is an integration. And we will look at that because I'm very fortunate to have a GitHub Copilot license. So yes, you can connect GitHub Copilot. Two ways. It is an extension, which you'll see here, GitHub Copilot. It's an extension, as well as you have to log into your GitHub account so that it knows you actually have a license. And that predominantly is usually like a personal account, but just to be aware of. Right. So the other thing I want to show you, so when we run, let's open up one of these AdventureWorks. Let's create a few queries, different query windows. Let's get some with customer things in. So you can do very similar things that you would do in Azure in SSMS. You know, select top-time rows, script as create. Sometimes the script as create can take a little bit of time. I find that feels like it takes more time than SSMS, but it's usually when I'm trying to do something against an Azure SQL database that it takes a lot of time, but it can take a little bit of time. But you can see here we've got multiple tabs. Now, if I was to get something and make sure it's on multiple tabs, just for the sake of it, oh, not that one, this one. Now, that's not a valid query, but I'm not doing it for the purposes of valid query because I want to show you this search feature. So this search feature is actually going to search across all open files as well as any folders I have open. So in this case, I should already have in the other window, we use this one. I'll do it in this one. So you can see here, it'll search across all open files and it'll let us know if it's one of the ones up here that I've got open or whether it's just a local file. So we can see SQL Query 1 is actually an open file, whereas Fabric Database 01 is a different file that I've just happened to have open in that Azure Data Studio. We can look at our notebooks. So in this case, I don't have any open, but I could create them there and I have a separate navigation for that. And then with the database projects, we get our own menu for database projects here once you've got it installed. So from this menu, I can work with my database project. This is not editing on a server. So I can go in and go into my sales tables and say, all right, for the customer, I want to add an extra column. That column is going to be, customer type. And you see the little gray ghosting text. That's sort of like Azure Data Studio, GitHub Copilot behind the scenes. Right. So we can make changes to the files. Now, this is only changing the file in the database project. We can then build it to make sure we've still got the referential integrity of our project. I can then publish that project and it's going to do a DAC pack publish. So it's going to take the build, put the build into a DAC pack and then try and publish that. So it's going to do the compare and the deploy to a server if I wanted to. It's simply go through the publish, go through the menus. We can even schema compare between the project and another server, two servers against each other. We might want to say a database in dev versus a database in test. We can do the schema compare. We can also generate the scripts to publish over the top using those menus. The other one we've got is to actually just navigate our files, which is a bit like what you do in VS Code if you're using that these days. So I've got a database project here for my Fabric SQL database, so I can navigate the files and I can see that Git integration. But if I go into the source control menu, that's where once I've initialized the repository, so in this case, this particular one is not, and I can't remember if I've got one, should have one, probably sitting in my temp drive, I reckon. Let's see, temp demo git, let's try that. Or yeah, that's recent. Yep, should be that. Don't save my open files, it's gonna reload with that. Beautiful. So now you can see if let's make a change just to make it obvious. So we'll put that customer type in here again. Voucher 100, note, not null. Cool. Now with that, when I go into the Git repo here, we see our customer SQL. So I can go into that, look at the changes, I can discard the changes, so effectively an undo, or I can go in and say, yep, adding the customer type. to customer for release, 5. And yep, that's fine. And then it says, you've got 3 changes that need to go up to the remote repo. I can tell it's a sync. It'll ask me, you sure you want to do that? I'm like, yep, absolutely, because it's just a little demo one. And in the bottom left, you'll see what Git repository you're connected to. So, if you want to switch branches, you can make sure that you're in the branch that you're working with. If you're doing feature branching, you can switch the branch, do a pull, make sure you've got everything that you need when you're working. But it means we can quickly commit changes. So we've got all those left navs. We've also got the user one, which you saw, so I can add another user. This is my GitHub profile. I can also add, that's then going to pop up an authenticator screen. So I can authenticate as another account if I wanted to and add that in. And the other thing that does is now that we've authenticated, when we're looking at our servers here, if we shift and look at the Azure one, it automatically has displayed all our Azure resources. So I can see I have a bunch of tenants here. If I go into one of my demo tenants, I'll be able to go, yep, in my MVP subscription, I think it is, I have a couple of SQL databases. And from there, I can go and connect to them, manage them, go and have a look at them. So it means I don't have to always remember the connection strings or type in the connection string. I can just navigate to them here. With Fabric SQL, you have to get the properties of the Fabric SQL, give you the SQL connection string. Make sure when you do use that, and I didn't prep a window beforehand, but with the Fabric SQL database, if you're using that one, when you do the connection, let's see, have I got one? Should have it down here, I think. Yeah. So you see this really long connection string? This will be in the properties of your Fabric database. Let's do Notepad++. Just open that up on another window. No, I don't want the latest version. Bring it over here. So you can see here, this is the giant long connection string. The interesting thing for connecting to a Fabric SQL database with tools like Azure Data Studio, the UI will call it Fabric Database 01, but when you look at the properties of the connection, the initial catalog will actually be this. So it's got the GUID attached on the end. So if you ever find connecting to a Fabric SQL database that it doesn't work, make sure you've got both the full database name in there, not just Fabric Database 01. In the same with if you're connecting to, say, an Azure SQL, if you don't have the firewall rules open to your client ID, you'll get a pop-up that'll appear in this pane saying, do you want to add your IP to the firewall rules for that server so that you can connect to it. And you get your standard errors like error 26 when you've got no access. That, to the question in the chat, is it Fabric Database or Warehouse? That one specifically was Fabric SQL Database. If you're using Data Warehouse or Lakehouse, you can connect to the SQL endpoint using the connection string that they have there. It'll have a similar looking GUID. I think it's actually data warehouse dot, like this one. Let me grab this out, and it won't have the GUID on the end. Fun times, if I recall correctly. So it'll be like that. So you'll have like data warehouse.fabric.microsoft.com, and I'll see if that one's, can't remember if that one's online or not. I tend to create a bunch of stuff and then delete it. Yeah, so with that one, with the warehouse endpoint, I didn't have to specify the database because it's effectively given me the databases or the data warehouses, lakehouses, either of the two, within that workspace. Because this GUID is kind of like a representation of the workspace ID and then .datawarehouse.fabric.microsoft. So I have two sitting in there. And you can query them like you would the Fabric UI, or you could also connect to Fabric with SSMS as well. So you can just do, select your top 100 and away you go. It might take a little while. And that will be indirectly querying the Delta Parquet under the hood, and then it'll come back. So that's, don't worry, this is dummy data. It's not real data either. But yeah, so that's the kind of little nuance between those is some you can just connect with the equivalent of like instance level, that workspace kind of ID. So if you go into any warehouses, it'll probably have the GUID for the workspace .datawarehouse.fabric.microsoft.com. Connect. I forget what the Lakehouse one has. I think it also is data warehouse dot, but it's a read-only SQL analytic endpoint as opposed to a read-write that Warehouse has, and then Fabric is both a read-write. The other thing is the Azure Data Studio, or just generally, database projects for Fabric SQL supports a lot of the features, but not pre and post deployment scripts. For Lakehouse, because Lakehouse is only a it isn't a read-write endpoint. The write only lets you do things like create views. So if you put anything in the database projects that's not that and try and publish to a lakehouse in Fabric, it will error because it's like, hey, you're trying to do something that you can't do on that endpoint. It's kind of good and bad because before with SQL Server database projects, when we were just doing like SQL Server 2005 through to 2022, what are we at now? 2022. With that, you could do the target on your database project, and then that would allow it to better check against the feature sets available for that version and do the referential integrity checking. When it comes to the Fabric ones, it's a little bit more cut down, so you can't use all the features that are available in a database project. Some other things I want to point out, the Control-Shift-P I talked about earlier, that's this little menu. So we can go into our snippets and configure snippets. Crazy thing is you don't just have to do them for SQL, you can do them for other languages. Because this is forked off the Visual Studio code base, you get extra features that you wouldn't necessarily associate with doing data work. So we can go into that SQL JSON snippets file, and this is going to be all my SQL snippets for the SQL language. So in this case, I've got a bunch. They're formatted horribly, but you can see I've got top 10, info schema stuff, some demos for past summit. So I can go in and create, if I go into a query window and just do new and start typing SQL, I get my little snippets. So you can see here, there's my info schema, there's my top 10. And if I drop those in, it'll automatically highlight the variable for the table. Good question. Is it possible to join two tables that are located in two different servers? If you're talking about on-prem SQL Server land or Elastic Pool, yes. If you're talking about things like Fabric SQL, Warehouse can connect to Lakehouse to query. I think Warehouse can actually connect to another warehouse. If you're doing SQL Server on-prem, you're using your link services and your three-part naming. If you're using your Elastic Pools, you're using the Elastic Pool query techniques to do cross. So technically, yes, with the caveat of it depends. But great questions. So the other thing we can do, so this is, let's just put a table in here. What's in the shortcut table? Customer, dimension, customer, and we get the IntelliSense, so we don't need to pay for extra products if we don't need to. So we can hit our format, and then that will format that. So in my case, I like multi-line stuff, so it's formatted that way. If, for example, I'm going to grab this query and put it over here for a bit of fun, and move that and hide that and zoom in a touch. The other thing I really like to do is when you get the debate of commas at the end or at the start, is to use, if you do Control, Alt, and the down arrow, that's the equivalent of column select. So I can just delete the comma and then hit the end key, and it'll take the ragged edge. So it'll pick up the ragged edge ending and put the comma back in. And then you can do other things like, if I want a single line of code, just do delete. You can get single line. Or I can do Shift Tab back to move it all and then delete. And now I can get sort of that single line stuff happening. And then if someone sends me a single line of code, I can go back to the format and get it full line again. The other cool thing you can do is if you're writing like merge statements, for example. A lot of people used to do this in stored procs or stored procedures. So I can just do a word highlight, take that, and I might go back and say this is source dot, and then I go to the end and I go equals target, paste. And now you can see how that's quickly generating probably what I would put in a lot of merge statements, doing my joins, doing my, case when this has been modified. What is it? If it's not in the source, do an insert. If it's in the source, not in the target, this, that, and the other, means it's quickly able to do that. You can also do crazy things like I can go down a few layers and randomly write stuff. Not that you'd do that, but it's kind of fun to freak out your colleagues sometimes. But we can do those sorts of things because we do have the ability to do a column select. The other thing I got used to is a lot of people would write comments like this, and there's nothing wrong with this, by the way. But what happens is if someone puts that into a single line, or someone or something, some of the tooling these days does it. We go do that, suddenly it's commented out all my columns, which can cause a bit of behavior problems. And then if we try and format that back to one line, we don't get the behavior we want. So I got in a bit of a habit that if I was going to be using tools that go back and forth between single line and multi-line, and I just want to format them nicely, I would use the block comment, even if it's one line, so that when someone goes in and goes, hey, let's send this to, say, reporting services where it can do this, then you don't lose the actual functionality of your code. And then we can go back in and format and get back to that multi-line The other thing, if we do Control-Shift-P again, user settings is where you find all the dashboards, which is where all the widgets are defined in. So if we search for dashboard, we'll get things like tabs, widgets. So now I can edit that widget file, and you can see here that it's just predefined. If I wanted to add my own, I would just create a SQL file that it knows what to attach it to and define another JSON block in there for that widget. And then that would appear in the context of wherever I put it. So there's a whole bunch of settings that we can customize within Azure Data Studio. And it's cool because we get the search feature so we don't have to remember where the heck they are. There's certain things like, I think it's like tabs to spaces or something. Tab size, 4 spaces. That's always a hot debate amongst data teams sometimes. The other one that I like to do is when I'm working with the servers. So if we go into one that has a few more tables, this one's probably better. So this is the search widget that I talked about earlier. So if we type customer in, we can see, we've got the dimension customer table. We've also got the top 10 customer view. So it's handy when people don't tell you what schema things are in, and we can go in and alter and script and create. We can also, when we're in that database, go, hey, look, convert that to a database project because I want to work with it locally to manipulate the changes and then do my schema compares and push them out. When I talked about having other things, there's this one down the bottom. This pane is really cool for PowerShell stuff. Of course, you can do different languages. I just choose to use PowerShell, but you can do git bash command line. The reason I do that is often when I'm doing things like if I'm on-prem, like AD user, I want to get the Active Directory information, or if I'm doing like Azure SQL stuff, I can do the login AZ, and this has changed since I've last done it, but it's like login AZ account or something like that. And it will pop up the MFA authentication and everything, but I can go in and just do it here. Sometimes I get a bit lazy and I don't like to use the Git integration to do my Git work. So I might come in here and do Git status. It won't work there because it's not got a Git repository. So if I go in here, this one should be a Git one. So I can do things like Git status. I can do my Git commit, my Git add. Sometimes I'll even have a file open. So in this case, let's change the language. So we're going to say instead of it being a SQL file, not that one, I want to do the other one. I just want a general file. New file. Text, plain text. So just a plain text file. Sometimes I'll write all my Git commands that I want to run. I might put some commentary in here, and just be like, series of Git commands. And then just put them all in. Or I might even have PowerShell ones. And then I could just highlight and say run in the terminal, and it'll run it in the terminal. Just got to make sure you're in the right context to use the different features there. So that's kind of cool. What else did I want to show you? So we got widgets, snippets, extensions, right? So with the extensions, most of these, when you click them, they'll come up with an install. Scroll to the bottom to ones I don't have installed. We can do Postgres, Redgate even have extensions in here. So you've got all sorts of things. SQL migration, we can install. Every so often, this will actually open up a website to get it. So if I hit this one, it's going to probably install locally, no drama. But there are other ones. I know the poor man T-SQL format. I wonder what this one, pastel theme.
So I typed Python here and I couldn't find anything. Just weird.
Probably Jupyter. The Jupyter ones.
JUPY.
Jupyter ones would be the ones. But sometimes, now where did that window just go? I'll re-click it. It already downloaded it. But what it's doing behind the scenes, now I'm just going to show you all on the screen for a second. So when I hit that download button, it's downloading this VSIX extension. Let's zoom in here. Oh, of course, it doesn't make the zoom any bigger. That's annoying. But the VSIX, what happens there is we can go in and say install an extension from a VSIX package, and then we locate that, and then we can go ahead and install it. So Poor Man SQL Formatter is one that does that. You go to the actual website, download the VSIX, and then install it inside, and then you can go use it. With things like GitHub Copilot, you install it first, then you configure it. With the GitHub Copilot, we can have it help us write code. So you'll see if I start writing things, now I probably need a different database, one that's got multiple tables. Let's do my local one. Let's go here. Oh, we can do a permission management as well, by the way. If you want to create like new users and things, you can do that. And I actually find the interface for that, if you like a GUI, is a bit nicer in Azure Data Studio than it was in SSMS. But lots of improvements happening in that space. Let's make this a bit smaller. So if we start writing, usually see how it's got that nice like backgrounded gray text. Let's go. There it goes. See how it's got all this text here? This is Copilot helping out behind the scenes going, I think you might want this, and I can just tab and it'll keep it. I'm just going to format it so it's a bit nicer. So GitHub Copilot is an efficiency improver in my books than most things. You can also start writing natural language queries, like, write a query to do top 5 customers by sales amount. And sometimes you can get it from that natural language to then create the query for you. But like any of the copilots, whether it's Office 365 Copilot, the Security Copilot, GitHub Copilot, the 6 copilots in Fabric, any of the copilots, they're there to help you, but you always want to do the whole trust but verify. So even if it wrote a query for me, I'm still going to go in and verify whether that query is like suitable for what we're trying to achieve, because sometimes it gets a bit delusional. And the other thing to be mindful of is, of course, GitHub Copilot and the various copilots have access to publicly available content. That's what a lot of them are trained with. So when you see demos, if you see people using like Wide World Importers, AdventureWorks, was it Contoso, the Froyo company, I think is the .NET one. A lot of those, it looks really slick in what it can do. Like, it realizes that it's customer ID joined to customer ID and can do some really cool stuff. But also remember that that information is publicly documented. So if you try and do the same sort of queries against your local solutions that you're building for your organizations or that you've inherited from your organization, where if you come into a new job and they've got all these databases and you go to use things like GitHub Copilot, it's not necessarily going to be like 100% being able to help you. It might just help you along the way. I think for people who are not super familiar with writing T-SQL, it can be quite handy in the same way that the Copilot in Power BI is handy for people who don't write DAX a lot, helps them along the way. And I think for those, it's taking away needing to do your core DB people or your people with, that SQL query writing experience. They can focus on the things that you need them for. And then you can use things like the Copilots, GitHub Copilot, to help train your more junior staff in doing things. So you can get them to prepare a query and then run it past another colleague within the team, as opposed to needing that colleague to help them write the query from the get-go. So it's kind of cool. You can do all sorts of things with the GitHub Copilot. And I saw at Ignite in Chicago, even with things like GitHub Copilot to help you do pull request reviews, which is pretty awesome. But the wider feature set for any of these tools, you can always find within the actual docs. So if we load up that extension, we can see all the things that it's going to get to do and how it does them. So you can see if you just write some commentary, you can get it to do it. You want to create a unit test if you're doing more coded language. I've not seen it do things like T-SQL-T. Yeah, T-SQL test framework. I've not seen it write that, but you can get it to help you write a SQL query, and you can see there that it's going to provide that. With some of the copilots, you can also go in and say, hey, this query's got an error, try and figure out how to fix it. Now, if you think about what GitHub Copilot's going to do to try and fix it, of course, it can probably reference some metadata to understand, you've got this column or that column. But if you're expecting it to write the logic for you, like, our business always filters to cost centers 1, 2, 3, and 4, it's probably not going to know that to be able to fix a query in that way. So it's going to be able to fix a query when it's something that it's more technical query language definition stuff and less business domain stuff. But it does mean you can quickly use it to get fast things done. I even use it sometimes when I just want to I will use the Copilot sometimes to write PowerShell, because I go, you know what? I'm going to write some PowerShell to do stuff in my terminal window. I've forgotten how to do it, like, I don't know, an AZ copy from a storage account. I can just go to the Copilot in the Edge browser and be like, hey, Edge Copilot, give me the PowerShell command to do XYZ. And then I'll review it. I can drop it in the terminal and off I go. So it's pretty powerful in that space. I'm trying to think there was something else I wanted to show you all. So we've covered off the Get, we've covered off So notebooks, let me see if on the other window I can, because I might have kept IPYNB. Don't worry, I'm not showing you anything you can't see. Let's see, do I have?
Possibly you can try the graphics ability to interpret your results, right? In the SQL query and get the
Oh,
output.
yes, we can look at that. Let's do
like totals and all that, and it can generate a graph for you, which is kind of very funky.
yeah. Let me open one of these. It may have already tried to open it in the background. Copy path.
Yeah, by the way, I tried to configure Python on my workstation at work. It went on
Can
for
be painful.
16 hours and I couldn't, but at my home
Uh,
computer, I was able to do it in literally 30 minutes.
it can get quite painful, but this is
Yes.
an example of a notebook. So this is one where you can deploy SQL 2022. This is courtesy of Microsoft to a Docker container, so it goes through all the different steps. There's another really cool one I got from Melissa Coates. She doesn't publish this one anymore. She's
I miss her.
retired, but
Yeah.
many years ago, she published a notebook about working with the Power BI activity logs. Let me grab this path, copy as path. And I used to love this. This is similar to what like some of the SQL Server ones look like, where they tell you about the features. So Melissa had this awesome notebook to take you through, check your PowerShell version, check your Power BI modules that you've got, and then for each of the different methods, it'll go through and tell you how to use them. So I use this to learn how to do the activity log downloading. Before you had things like the Fabric events, but there's a number of different blogs. But this was cool to just be able to run PowerShell to go, I want to connect to my Power BI tenant. I was a Power BI admin, so I could do this, connect to my Power BI tenant and dump out all the activity logs because I started storing them in JSON files. Now, when we talk about the queries, let's see if we've got one that's still open that has a result set in it. If not, I'll just write a select, and that's easy. Let's do a bit of cleanup. So many windows. Cool. So here, with this open, now you can see that these are where we get the different saves. So we can save as Excel, as CSV. We can also go to JSON. So let's just drop this down to say 10 and run that. We can also change. So this is connected to one SQL server. We can change it, connect to another one. We can look at our query execution plans. It wasn't there in the early versions of Azure Data Studio, but now it is. So if I go to say downloads, results.json, and then now I have that same T-SQL result set in JSON format. So this is kind of cool to interrogate your JSON back and forth. It's also good when you're trying to do the 4XML and the 4JSON stuff. If you want to try and debug, you can do this simpler. The visual representation of your results is a little bit basic. You can install ones called like things like Sandance, I think is one of it.
Yeah, Sandance, yeah.
Sandance is kind of crazy. I've only ever seen it in Azure Data Studio, but if you want really good visuals, you're probably going to use Power BI, Tableau, any of those sorts of techniques. But it is handy that you can install this extension in Sandance. Now, see if it's going to let me do it straight off the bat. It will. So now we can go in and change and go, I want it in a grid format. I want it in a bar format. Actually, I want to put the buying group on the axes. I want to group it by, the category, sort by, apologies if anyone's colorblind because this is red green at the moment. We can sort it by, customer, which is an odd thing to sort by. We're going to show that, we can put the sum in, does nothing, do a count back. Cool. So we can do all these different things just within the Sandance visual. You can change your palette. So if we don't want to go green, we can go, let's go pastel, and it'll change it all out. The other thing we can do with our query result set that you can't do in SSMS as easy is I can just take a subset of column data, copy it. I just did a Control-C and I can paste it. I can also filter. So I go, actually, we just want to look at the 103 result set. And now I can see just that result. I can still do the same with copying the whole row. And it will tell me, yep, you've copied one row. That's great. And I get the column headers as well as the row values in some cases, which is what you could also do in SSMS as well as Azure Data Studio. This filter is restricted to, I think, 5,000 characters, if I remember. User settings. Oh, back one. User settings. Forget what it comes under. This one. No query limit.
Heidi, we are at 1 hour mark now.
Oh,
Coming up.
perfect. But yeah, you can
no
change it. So I always hate when it gives me a warning saying, hey, you've gone over 5,000, lines. So I just edit the config and change it so I can query whatever I like. But to wind us up, let's see. So of course, it's awesome. We can do GitHub Copilot. Unfortunately, GitHub Copilot is a paywall thing. It's like 20, I want to say $20 US per month per user, unless you have any sort of enterprise aspects like MVPs. We get access sometimes to some of these things for free as part of our MVP benefits. But that is our session for today. Thank you for all your awesome questions. Thanks for having me. And I hope that's been able to help you sort of either get started with, go deeper into, or just work with Azure Data Studio going forward. It's kind of cool.
Thank you. Gwen, do you want to take over, my friend?
Yes. So for the rest of the session, if anyone have any question, please go ahead and ask Heidi now. Oh, I see a hand with Armando. Go ahead, Armando.
Yeah, just a very quick thing. I just saw that Copilot, it was announced for free for Visual Studio. Probably soon it's going to be for Azure Data Studio as well.
Hopefully. The fun one with the GitHub or just the Copilots in general, they behave differently. So things like GitHub Copilot in Azure Data Studio, Visual Studio Code will behave differently in what functionality they introduce and not introduce. But anytime someone asks me about Copilot, my first response is which one? Because it's 13 plus now, and it gets very confusing. I mean, we're pretty sure they're talking about a Microsoft one, but then which Microsoft one is could be any. And I saw Fabric SQL is even getting a Copilot now, so it's kind of cool. But I'm super excited if it's going to be free in any shape and form, because the more people that these tooling can get to, the more people it can help. So I'm totally going to look that up now and just check how I can get it for free in my work computer.
Let me stop the recording now. 1 sec. But we'll still continue with the awesome